super exciting to be here. And it's the first time that I will give this talk, but I will give this talk again to the AXCON that was before mentioned earlier in Radimir's introduction. So I'm very interested to hear about your feedback on what I'm presenting, especially because also I tried to make it as accessible as possible, although it's pretty visual and technical topic that we're going to talk about today. Before I move on with my talk, I would just like to take a minute to express my gratitude. I'm still pretty new in this community. I think I've been attending the Ali Meetup for a year now, but I cannot recount how many times I have found fascinating articles, hear very great talk, and heard about amazing video also online related to accessibility, and that helped me grow in this discipline. So thank you all for being here and enriching this community. And all my appreciation also especially goes to the organizer of the Ali Meetup, so Radimir, and also Francisca, who organized this conference that is enabling us to have this moment of togetherness despite the current situation. Coming back to my presentation, a few more words about me. I'm Marion. I'm a French designer living in Berlin and working at Futurize, a European strategy, design, and engineering consultancy. And at Futurize, my role is mostly about designing user experience and user interfaces for digital products that are brought by our clients. But I am also actively part of an internal workforce, which primary goal is to inform and develop accessibility practices in and outside the company. For instance, we've been organizing last year a GAD event, and we hope to organize another one next year, or this year already. I started, as I mentioned, to focus really on digital accessibility about a year and a half ago. And I'm wondering if you can recall how you felt when you started to learn about this topic. Because for me, there are two things that keep on accompanying me even today. The first one is that I always feel shocked to see how inaccessible the web is. Last year, the WebAM Association released this update on their 1 million homepages survey that revealed that among the top 1 million websites in the world, there is 98% of the homepages that have detectable WCAG failure, which are web content accessibility guidelines. So errors that are specified into this very specific guidelines, right? So I don't even think about the thing that are not encompassing with this documentation. And yeah, I mean, this is crazy. At the same time, I think I'm always surprised to see how much I still have to learn about accessibility every day, because accessibility is a huge topic. It's like diving in the immensity of the space. And just for the sake of demonstration, I tried to make a small enumeration of all the topics I tackled since I started to focus on accessibility. They are, of course, the WCAG regulation, but also color contrast. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about. This is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Yeah, that's right. Then disabilities, universal design principle, disability rights movement, assistive technologies, and so on and so on. I'm not going to go through the whole list. But just to say, there's always something new to learn. And often, while inaccessible practices keep on being perpetuated on the web, I have the feeling I still need to learn. And sometimes I wonder, what can I do? How can I contribute meaningfully to make the web more accessible for everyone? if I have still so much things to learn. And this is a big question, but I try to stay pragmatic and to simply do my job well. And as a designer, I have tons of opportunities to improve the accessibility of digital products. And I try to do my best every day. But as Beatrice mentioned, it's true that it's rarely the case that one has the opportunity to have the right time and the right budget to make those changes happen. However, I recently got the chance to work on a real retrofitting project, so a real accessible improvement that I had to bring to the project on which I was working. And this specific retrofitting project was about one of the most common WCAG failure that the WebAM report was highlighting, meaning low text contrast. So I was working on this project. I cannot tell you much about the what because of non-disclosure agreements. But what I can tell you is that this is the kind of project where there is a lot of information on the main interface, like a kind of table-based product with a lot of data. And one of the problems that was reported to us by our users was that they were having a hard time to read parts of the product. So my task was to improve the gray tone palette that was massively used for text color to ensure that the text would be legible for everyone. And then we had to define an evaluation criteria. As we were very low on budget, there was no window or opportunity to test the improvements made to the interface. And therefore, we went for the success criterion 1.4.3 from the WCAG, which states that the text, states that the contrast ratio between a foreground and a background, and when I say foreground, I especially target text, should be of minimum 4.5 for 1. Defining this scope and this evaluation criteria were the first step, and it's very important because when you do retrofitting, it's really easy to be tempted on legacy design or code to broaden scope. So it's really important to have this well defined. Now, I would like just to have a quick word about the setup, and then I will move on with the different steps I took for this process. There are different color models, and you might be familiar with 2 of them. The RGB one that is used for screen, and that is basically mapping the color on the screen. And the other one is the CMYK, yes, the one for print. And in this color model, there are different color representation. So the way we map the colors in the model might differ. For RGB, for instance, one of the way we map color is hue, saturation, brightness. That is also called HSD. And another one is hue, saturation, lightness. And then there is, of course, RGB. Personally, when I have to work with color and to iterate on it and compare different value, I prefer to use HSB because it helps me to differentiate the tone better. It doesn't mean that it's a must, that if you ever have to do this, you have to go for this color representation. But what is important is that you have to pick one and more or less stick to it so that you can compare more easily the value that you come up with. Something that I also see happening in a lot of design files, so I assume a lot of designers tend to do that, is to confuse opacity with brightness or lightness, depending on what you're using as a criteria. So basically, to make a color look lighter or brighter, they would lower the opacity level. The problem with this practice is that opacity is meant to introduce transparency into color and not to make it brighter. And when opacity is used in a palette of a design system, for instance, it can result in a lot of problem when applied to specific component on an interface. If such a tone that has opacity inside is applied to the background of a tooltip, for instance, it can make it really hard for our users to read the text because the background of this tooltip might be displayed on top of other text. And this example I have already encountered. So this is like based on my experience. But there is a lot of different situations where introducing opacity in your color palette can be very bad. And the last thing that you need when you work on retrofitting for color palettes is a contrast checker. So basically a tool that will allow you to make a comparison between two different tones that you will set as background and foreground, so that you can assess what is the contrast ratio, because if you were to do the math by yourself, well, you will probably get overtime. Personally, I like to use the WebAM contrast checker, but if you would prefer something that is closer to the design software that you're using, so that you don't have to do the back and forth with the browser, there are also contrast checker integrated in plugins like Stark or Able that you can add to Figma or Sketch or Adobe XD or whatever you're using for design. Okay, now that we have covered the setup, I'd like to talk about the second step, that was about analyzing the status quo, which basically means comparing the design documentation with the actual product. In our case, we originally had 8 tones, including 2 light tones for backgrounds, 3 tones ranging from dark to mid-gray for text, 2 tones, 1 lighter and 1 darker for something called lines, and 1 last tone for disabled element. I quickly compared this palette with our product online, and I noticed that some tones were used on production, but were not documented in the design file. And oops, Entschuldigung. Okay, and this is a pretty common mistake in digital products that most of the time reveal a problem in the alignment between the design and the development team. But in my case, it was really crucial to be aware of those inconsistencies, because the method I decided to go for, as we had such light background, was to identify the darkest of the light of the darkest background, although it's a light color, to compare against the different font color. So if I was not able to identify properly the background, the darkest background, then I couldn't have gone further, or I would have to repeat the work again once I realized what is the darkest background. So I added this tone to our base palette once I identified it, and then I could do a first contrast check. And this is where I realized that only the primary text, so the first level of text color, was color contrast compliant for the AA level. And one thing I shall note here is that using this specific method of identifying the darkest background is something that works very well if you have this case where there is only light backgrounds. But if you have a product that use light and dark themes, or if you have various color background, then you need to go for a different strategy. And basically, you need to be able to compare the different value against one another. For that, there is one great contrast checker that I can recommend that is called Contrast Grid. And it's great because you can evaluate multiple combinations of background and foregrounds at the same time. Anyway, my approach to experiment with those different tones was to start by redefining the darker tone for the tertiary text color, so the third level of text, and then to proceed gradually to the primary text color, so that the tertiary text color is meant to be the closest from the WCAG AA compliance level, which is 4.541, and the primary text color had to be the furthest away. And that way, the contrast of the text color would align with the text hierarchy. When working with color, it is tempting to rely on big surface, basically rectangle, that you put next to one another to compare how the color is different from one tone to another. And I think it's a necessary step in the process, but it's really important that you do a reality check. And for that, you need to compare the different experimentation that you do with the color tones with a part of the interface. And for my case, I choose the filter bar from our product. And there are two main reasons why I picked this one. First of all, this specific component had the free level of hierarchy inside the text color. And the other reason is that the filter bar, although somehow manageable to iterate on, so I don't need to change too much when iterating on it, was a component that has a very high density of information and very various elements on it, which was really allowing me to compare those three different levels of text color in this kind of worst case context. And when I did the first experiment, I realized that when applied on a filter component, the checkbox that have an outline with that has the outline from the original palette didn't seem to belong to the same element as the checkbox label on which I added this darker tone. Somehow the darker tone of the primary text was making the checkbox border even less visible. So as a result, I decided to go beyond the scope and to also try to work on part of the palette that was not dedicated to text for the sake of harmony, let's say. And for that, I decided to have a specific part of, I kind of reshuffled the original palette and I renamed it. And so there was a new part in this palette called graphic element that I could use to put any kind of component that was not textual, but yet used against the background. And for this first iteration, I had to add one tone for disabled text, so in the text category, and then two tones for disabled and hover states of what was previously called dark lines, because also I realized that this differentiation between dark lines and light lines was not very easy to make. So I also renamed those categories so that they are interactive element or graphic element that has to be darker than decorative one. I submitted my iteration to design review with my team, and although the improvement of the text contrast was appreciated, I got the feedback that the tone used on the border of component like checkboxes and text input should be lighter. Usually I take feedback very well, but in this case I was more conflicted. And my problem was that the tone I selected for those graphic elements was already the brightest I could have to maintain a contrast ratio of 3:1. That is the threshold to reach the AA level of compliance for graphic element. And here comes back the importance of the scope again, right? Because as my task was really primarily focused on text and not on graphic elements, I realized that I had to let go on this. What I did, however, in the final version of the palette was to split the graphic element into two distinct categories: the icons on the one side and the line on the other hand. As we had multiple cases where icons were used alone on the interface to trigger specific features, it was somehow equally important for them to be legible as for the text. And therefore, in the final version of the gray tone palette, we had 4 tones for text, including 3 levels of hierarchy, and 2 of them reaching the AAA level of compliance and 1 the AA, plus 1 tone for disabled text that isn't compliant in alignment with the regulation from the WCAG 2.1. And then there was also 4 tones for icons, including 3 states for interactive icon. The enable and hover states are reaching the AA level of compliance, and 1 tone for decorative icons that was not reaching the AA level of compliance. And also 4 tones for lines, including as well 3 states for dark line, or as I call them here interactive element, that were mostly used on borders, as you saw maybe in the filter component, and 1 tone for light line that was used for dividers. So in the end, the compliance was achieved for most components, except the borders that are used on interactive elements such as checkbox and input field. It's a lot, right? But it was only the beginning of the way for me, because once this work around experimentation and finding and enhancing the palette was done, then I had to roll out to the whole interface, which is a very great way to test how your system is well implemented. Fortunately for me, it was fairly well implemented in a project, yet by doing this rollout, I also discovered edge case that I didn't have insights when I did the preparation, and which was this darker background than the one I use as a reference for a button. So when I realized that, I had a lot of pressure, like, oh my God, all this work for nothing, I have to do everything again. But fortunately for me, we are only using the primary text on this component and the disabled text for the disabled state. And therefore, when I did the contrast ratios check, I was relieved to see that we were meeting the compliance threshold. But with this edge case, what I realized is that I should have done a proper interface inventory of the background's color in the beginning. And I think this edge case really made me realize how much of a bottleneck this method was, like this darkest background method was creating around the identified darkest background. Also, with this edge case, I realized that I needed to document them and add them to the current palette. And there I felt also very challenged to keep on a consistent naming. As you might have noticed by now, I tried to refine the palette naming convention so that it becomes easier for developers and designers to know which tone to use where. Because I noticed that in different teams, this is a problem that is often happening. And my technique using word like interactive and decorative was also to create that in alignment with the WCAG specific wording to add this connection right in between the project and the regulation. And at the moment, I was not really capable of finding a suitable naming on top of those that I already added. But here I would really, if you ever find yourself in this situation, I would really recommend to have a discussion with your team, because naming conventions are very important for the team collaboration. And I think in the best world, they should be agreed between each and every member of a team. Now that I think about it, and when I was designing those slides, I realized I could have called that surface, but it doesn't really, it's not mattering as much as it was at that time. But the most important in there was to document all that work appropriately so that people can use and rely on the system that I've tried to put together with this task. And so to do that, I documented each tones in the Figma file that we are working on. I think Figma has a very good feature for that is allowing people to give a specific description for each component. So I really would recommend to use this documentation feature so that developers, when they go into the file and look for specific instruction on components, they can find when and where to use certain colors, for instance, for my case. And I also created a guide that I shared with my team and that I presented to them by the end of this project. To conclude, I hope that this example of retrofitting inspires you to find ways to go beyond the quick fix from legacy design or program. I know that retrofitting isn't really easy or fun to deal with. But dealing with legacy code and design, dealing with legacy code and design is constraining, and it won't probably lead to the most ideal solution in terms of accessibility, and would also represent a direct cost. Those are things that I've heard all along the way I was learning for the CPAC certification. Yet I believe that in retrofitting, there is not only the challenge of making an existing non-accessible feature accessible, but also the opportunity of implementing more accessible practices as a core principle of a product. And that is what matters in the end, because if you ask me how much I made this project accessible, to be honest, I cannot tell you. And even if we're just talking from a compliance point of view, I think my contribution is also questionable, because in this presentation, you might have noticed that I completely omitted the question of the font size. That is also a defining factor for compliance in the contrast ratio rules. And in this project, there are a lot of font sizes that are below the 16 CSS pixels. Yet what matters, to me at least, is that now the color contrast for this project is envisioned at its core, and therefore hopefully durably from an accessibility point of view. Finally, I'd like to give a shout out to my product team, because those kind of projects are a team effort, and they gave me valuable feedback to improve this project. And I would also like to give a special acknowledgement to Kilian Kottmeyer and Fotis Papadogeorgopoulos for proofreading the article on which this presentation is based. And yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback. So you can get in touch with me on Twitter, or you can send me an email. This presentation would be available soon after this event, but I also added further readings on color geekiness, let's say, if you want to dive deeper into those questions of how dealing with color contrast and so on. Thank you.